So today I'm going to speak about that essentially the book of Genesis is a tragedy. Okay. But the tragedy itself begs the question of how God creates a world that's supposed to be very good, and it ends up becoming a world of tragedy and slavery. And I think that ultimately the answer is that what's very good about the world is the human spirit that can transcend slavery. The book of Genesis starts with the goodness of creation, with everything wonderful and optimistic, and then we end up with slavery, and everything falls apart. And in fact, Rashi, at the beginning of Parshat Vayehi, reflects this idea. Parshat Vayehi is the only parsha in the entire Torah that starts in the middle of a paragraph. The Torah is set up in paragraphs. Vayehi is the only parsha that starts in the middle of a paragraph, and Rashi explains that the reason why it starts in the middle of a paragraph, which is kind of like an enclosed place, is because there's this anticipation of the slavery of the Jewish people. And of course, the question is what's the meaning of the tragedy of the book of Genesis? It seems to be improbable that God starts the world with promises of goodness, and yet immediately everything disintegrates and it ends up becoming a book that is looking forward to slavery and looking forward to evil and looking forward to oppression. And I think the answer is found in the character of Yosef. Yes, the book of Genesis is a tragedy. Yes, the book of Genesis, everything goes wrong. Everything goes downhill. But it's in the character of Joseph, who really gets the last words in the book of Genesis and Sefer Bereshit, that we begin to understand what is truly good about the world. What is this grand optimism that God has at the beginning of creation? And Joseph, at the end of his life, turns to his family and he says, you know, we're all going to die now. We're all older people. We're on in years. And he says, you know what, after I die, God is going to take us out of this slavery. I know that we're going to end up becoming slaves, but God is going to redeem us. Everything will be good in the end. There is hope and there is optimism. And I think it's in the character of Yosef that we understand what is really good about the book of Genesis. Yosef is someone who suffers and suffers greatly in his life. His brothers hate him. He's sold into slavery. He's thrown into prison. He's abused, and at times his life is in great danger. Yet Yosef manages to transcend everything. And despite all of his difficulties, he remains positive and he remains optimistic. Yosef is a survivor, and he's a survivor who comes out of his difficulties and out of his oppression with his sense of optimism intact. And it is in Yosef that we see the goodness of Sefer Bereshit. You know what's good about Sefer Bereshit? You know what's good about the book of Genesis? The human spirit. There is nothing greater than the human spirit. And in Yosef's case, we see the optimism of a survivor. To that one can say that things are still good. And even if the book of Bereshit is a tragedy, because it starts out in goodness and ends up in slavery, things are not that bad yet. Because you have Yosef, you have survivors, and you have optimism. I think about this because every year on the March of the Living, where the students go to Poland to visit the death camps, they're accompanied by a survivor. In fact, we just had the yahrzeit of one of the survivors in our synagogue, Meyer, who used to go every year on a yearly basis with the March of the Living. And what I find remarkable about these survivors is that every year they go with these young teenagers. Every year they tell their story. But every year they do more than just tell their story. They explain to these teenagers why it's important to be a Jew. Why even though Jews have suffered greatly in their past, we need to be optimistic about a wonderful Jewish future. We need to be optimistic about the future of the world. And that message is a powerful message. And ultimately that message is the message of Sefer Bereshit. The Sefer Bereshit ends with the optimism of a survivor. And the optimism of a survivor, no matter how difficult the world around them is, makes the world into a good world. And if we can grab hold of that optimism, then the world is always good. no matter how tragic things are. Shabbat Shalom.